So what are we going to do? Just some background information about lead and the lead and copper rule. Some of you probably know more about lead than I do. We'll review where we currently are in the process. Then we'll talk about the proposed draft rules. And then we'll go on to tell you what the next steps and what the schedule is going to be. So background, just to frame our conversation today and where we're at. Obviously, there's no known safe level of lead exposure. The safe level of lead exposure is 0. Children are more susceptible to lead exposure than adults are. We are focusing drinking water exposure, understanding that drinking water exposure can be a minimal pathway. But as we reduce other exposures to lead, as we took lead out of gas, we take lead out of paint, the percentage that's coming from drinking water tends to ramp up as an overall exposure to lead. So as we progress in removing lead from the environment, that lead that is in drinking water can become more significant. We're focusing on the risky, if you will, parts of the system. So the older parts, if you have an older home, odds are you've got lead paint and you may have lead pipes in your house. Biggest concern with lead, again, is young children and infants who tend to absorb more lead than adults do. It leads to impaired mental development, IQ deficits. DEQ, we are not the health experts. We rely on our partners in Health and Human Services and your local health departments to help us out, and they had a table out there to answer any specific health-based questions. Sometimes copper kind of gets left out of the conversation because there's so much focus on lead, but this is the lead and copper rule, and we are trying to reduce exposure to copper, and copper brings its own issues with it. So where's the drinking water lead coming from? And one point I want to make is this water distribution system that we're dealing with is a very complex system. There's a lot of different parts. No two parts seem to be the same between communities or drinking water systems. I do want to point out that lead in water mains is very rare. Very rarely do we see any lead in water mains. Very rarely do we see any lead in the water that's being used as a source or in the finished water that your water systems are delivering to you. Where lead comes into play is once it comes off this water main, if you can see where I'm pointing there. Tell you what, we'll adjust that. So you've got your water main here, you've got your gooseneck or your pigtail or whatever you want to call it. This is where lead really starts coming into the system, and this is where we're trying to focus. You've got your gooseneck, that can be made out of lead. You've got the line itself can be made out of lead. You get into the house, and these are portions of the distribution system that aren't under the control of the water system, yet we're still tasking them to treat the water to prevent metals from leaching into the system for a part of the system that they don't control. So you've got older homes had solder in their copper pipes. That solder can contain lead. You've got sometimes galvanized pipes. What happens with galvanized pipes is they deteriorate over time, and if you got a lead pipe ahead of them, particulate lead can find its way into the pits of the galvanized pipes, so those can be a storage method for lead. And then you've got faucets. Brass fixtures tend to have lead in them. And the interesting thing is that when you treat orthophosphate to protect the lead pipe, sometimes you exacerbate the problems with the brass fixtures. So you treat for one problem and you cause another. There's a lot of those issues in drinking water systems. We dose our systems with phosphate, and then you drink the water, it goes through the system and comes out to a water treatment plant. Now you've got phosphate, which is a fertilizer, going into water treatment plants, and they've got limits on how much phosphate they can discharge. So there's a balance there. And again, like I said, it's very complex. You've got water systems. No two water systems are the same. No two neighborhoods in a community served by the water system are the same, and no two houses in a neighborhood are the same because of the variance that you see in the distribution system. Now, because of all these metals, obviously, the EPA in 1991 enacted the lead and copper rule. So the lead and copper rule is 26 years old. I think there's been a couple of changes to it, but it is a pretty old rule. Michigan obviously incorporated that into its state codes and state law. And again, a misunderstanding with the lead and copper rule is not a health-based rule. The lead and copper rule was intended as an indicator to address corrosion control treatment. How corrosive is your water? It was not a health-based standard. It established an action level, not a health level. It's an action level to indicate to the water treatment plant that maybe their water is corrosive or the corrosion control technique they're using isn't effective and that we need to change something. And obviously the purpose is to minimize lead and copper that gets exposed into the drinking water, reduce the water corrosivity, and remove lead service lines as a last resort. So who does the lead and copper rule apply to? Well, here's the two types. Part of the complexity of the lead and copper rule and the Safe Drinking Water Act are all the definitions. So here's two definitions for you. Community water supplies and non-transient, non-community water supplies. Basically, these are areas where people live or where people go to routinely day after day and get exposed to a potential source of lead in their drinking water. There's approximately 2,700 total in the state of Michigan, so that's a lot of water supplies. So the lead and copper rule requires these systems to take samples at taps, at faucets in a kitchen or a bathroom in a residence. So once they do the testing, they establish an action level. And action levels obviously are based on the 90th percentile. That 90th percentile doesn't mean there's lead in the water. That's just an average across all their sampling locations. It's a complicated method to determining the 90th percentile. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense sometimes, and that's part of the rule that we're looking at and trying to make more sense. And again, a supply that exceeds the action level, that's exactly what it is. It's an action level. They have to take action to try and reduce the corrosivity of their water. And right now, the action level for lead, as most people know, is 15 parts per billion. The action level for copper is 1,300 parts per billion. So where are we in the rule revision process? First of all, this process, this effort is just a small piece of the overall effort in the state of Michigan to reduce exposure to lead. You've got several other efforts being led to try and reduce lead exposure. You've got the Child Lead Exposure Elimination Commission that we work with and provide information to. So just understand that the lead and copper is just a small piece of an overall effort to reduce exposure to lead. Our intent is to obviously to make the lead and copper rule more effective, make it more understandable, reduce the exposure to people of lead to improve public health. Where did we start with our recommendations? Well, obviously, you've got Flint. You've got the Flint Water Interagency Coordinating Committee recommendations, and you've got the Flint Water Advisory Task Force. We started with those two documents, as well as a couple of documents from the EPA in their efforts to improve the lead and copper rule. We took this information and we started prioritizing where we could make the most impact in the lead and copper rule. And then we got a stakeholder group together and we presented basically a few recommendations of where to change, and they kind of took it from there. And again, the stakeholders have put in a lot of hard work and dedication and a lot of open and honest conversations in that stakeholder group, some of who are here today. None of this was done in a vacuum. None of this was done by the DEQ sitting in a room and deciding what we want to do. This was all generated through stakeholder input, both advisory groups, advocacy groups, health groups, public water supplies, and regulators as well. So into the meat of what we're doing here, the lead and copper rule changes. We're only focusing on these. What I'm going to talk about now is not the whole lead and copper rule. Again, this is a very small part of the lead and copper rule, but it's where we thought we could prioritize changes to have the biggest impact to public health. There's a lot more to the lead and copper rule than just the 7 areas I'm going to talk about. And again, this is probably not the last effort to improve the lead and copper rule. We're going to have a lot more efforts in the future to further strengthen it. So here's the 7 areas that we looked at that we thought we could have the biggest impact to public health. Getting an idea through the distribution system materials inventory of actually what's out there. Requiring lead service lines to, no kidding, be replaced, not as a last resort, but as a proactive measure. Improving sample collection locations. Improving sampling procedures. Lowering the lead action level and establishing a household advisory level. Promoting transparency and openness to the public about what's going on with their drinking water system and supply, and then strengthening our corrosion control and treatment techniques and requirements. So the first one, the distribution system materials. Obviously, the distribution system consists of a lot of different pieces. It's very complex because you've got a lot of different materials in there. You've got materials in people's houses that you don't really control, and they can pretty much put whatever they want in there. There's a wide variety in the records that we've found with water treatment systems. Some of them have outstanding records. Some of them have, you ask them what's in their system, and not only can they tell you exactly what's in their system, they can pop up a GIS map and tell you where the valves are, how old they are, when they're going to be replaced, that kind of thing. Other systems, not so much. Other systems have old 3x5 cards with handwritten notes on them and scribbles, and they're in a file cabinet in somebody's office in the drinking water plant. Excuse me. So you've got an extremely wide variety. So we're trying to get a handle on that and get that improved. Current rule, it required an inventory initially. Some of those inventories can be old, can be 26 years old, back when the rule first came out. There was no requirement to submit those inventories to the state. So we pretty much took it on faith that the supplies did their job. The proposed changes, we're asking supplies to give us, within a year of the rule, a quality check on how they think their inventory, so their supply inventory is. Is it good? How much faith do you have? How confident are you that you know what's in your distribution system, where your lead is, and where your other components are? After that, we're asking supplies to validate, to verify their inventory. So we're basically giving them another 4 years to go out and validate, verify what their inventory is. Now, what that consists of, we're not, we can't require supplies to dig up every lead and service line. That is not, or every service line, it's not reasonable. To be 100% verified, though, that's basically what you'd have to do, because you don't know what's happened in a homeowner's yard. If they had some landscaping installed and snagged the water line, you could have had a plumber come out there and take a piece of lead pipe out and put a piece of copper in. And if you tried to dig up that one section and find a copper pipe there, that doesn't mean that there's not a lead component somewhere else in the system. So it's very difficult and very complex to field validate this. So we're going to ask the water supplies to use what they know about their system to go out there and validate their inventory. And once they validate the inventory, they're going to submit that to the state. So we'll have a copy of what their inventory is as a quality check. Also, they will be required to update their inventory every 5 years, so it's not a stagnant thing. It'll be updated. If they do find a lead service line, we're going to require them to notify the homeowner so that the homeowner will know if they have a lead service line. Excuse me. Lead service line replacement. So what is a service line? What is the definition of a lead service line you think is pretty simple? Well, it's not simple because every system is the same. In Michigan, pretty much we have water meters here. They're sitting inside the house. Some places have water meters out here on the curb. So how do you define what is the service line? So we've defined the service line as basically this connection here all the way into the house. That is the service line in the state of Michigan. We tried to make that definition clear and as simple as we possibly can, so there's no ambiguity as to what constitutes a service line. Obviously, the older they are, back in the 30s and 40s, you had lead commonly used as a material because it was easy to work with, it's easy to bend. World War II came along and lead was used other places, so that began to be not because of any conscious effort to remove lead from the system, but just because lead was used for something else at the time. So our proposed rule change gets in there and actually requires lead service lines to be replaced. The current rule only requires lead service line replacement as a last resort. Once you exceed your action level, you go through a lot of steps to try and improve your corrosion control, try and reduce the lead that's leaching into the water, and if nothing works, then you start replacing lead service lines at about 7% per year. We want to replace that with a proactive, get the lead out rule that requires public water supplies to actually remove all the lead service lines, including the homeowner's portion, at water supply expense. Again, that's a resource-intensive activity, and it's not cheap. We originally looked at establishing a certain number of lead service lines to replace per year, but we went to an average of 5% over 20 years to get to 100% lead service line removal. And we did that because of the communities have asset management plans. They have a program to go in and replace water mains and replace parts of the service. So if you've got a water system out there that's going to replace a big water main and 15% of their lead service lines are connected to that water main, it just makes sense to let them wait 3 years until they do that project and replace 15% of their lead service lines in year 3, rather than forcing them to go outside of an asset management plan or outside what they would normally do just to hit a number. So that 5% is an average over the years that'll get us removed within 20 years. It also requires galvanized pipes that are hooked up to lead to be removed as well, to remove that potential source of lead. Again, it's done at water system expense. So the homeowner, obviously they have an option not to allow you to replace their lead service line, but that reduces that option. And the thing we're trying to get at here is to get the lead service lines out of the system. So the supplies have to offer to replace the private portion of the lead service line at supply expense. The homeowner can obviously decline that. If they do decline that, there was an option to ban partial lead service line replacements because we found that that's problematic, that can increase exposure to the lead by taking only half or a portion of the lead service line out. So if a supply decides to reduce their liability and the homeowner's not going to allow them to remove their lead service line for whatever reason, we're going to allow the supply to remove their lead service line portion with some stipulations, with some protections for the homeowner and the occupants of the residence. So we're going to place some restrictions on partial lead service line replacements with this rule. Sample collection location. Again, you're dealing with sampling pools that could be 20, 25 years old. A lot changes in 20 years. And sometimes those inventories and the things that those sampling pools were based on back in the 1990s turned out to be incorrect. And so we weren't sampling at the highest risk sites. So we need to correct that. So we're proposing some changes to improve the sampling pools out there. So the original rule, obviously the pools were designated up to 26 years ago. There was no requirement to send those to the state. Again, we're trusting the water supplies to do what they need to do. The updated rules will clarify what a lead service line is. Like I told you, if you have a gooseneck that's lead, that constitutes a lead service line. It updates the site selection criteria to make sure that the highest risk sites are the ones we're sampling at. And again, 2020 was the deadline set up to provide the sampling pools. So sampling procedure and frequency. The current rule is a one draw, is a 1 liter after a certain stagnation time. That gives you a good idea of what's in the fixture in the house. It may not give you a good idea of what the overall risk for lead exposure is. And again, the currently allow reductions in monitoring up to 3 years if they meet certain criteria. So the proposed changes, we're requiring annual monitoring for supplies with corrosion control in place, at all supplies with corrosion control in place, and all large supplies that's over 50,000, serving over 50,000 people. At sites with lead service lines, we're going to require 2 draws. Now, this is not a perfect solution. The intent here is to get the first draw to find out what's in the fixture, what's in the kitchen faucet. The second draw is to get an idea of what's in the lead service line out in the yard. Like I said before, every house, every place is different, so there's no one right rule. We're not always going to hit that lead service line. So this 2 draw, you take your first sample, you weigh a specified volume of water, and then you take your second sample. Then the highest of those 2 are what's reported for your 90th percentile. So the idea is to try and get an idea of what's in the service line and what's in the faucet, what's in the fixture. We're also going to prohibit flushing in anticipation of compliance monitoring, but we still want people to flush. So there's not going to be a designated amount of time. We're not going to make folks wait 7 days. If you're flushing your household system out every Tuesday and you're cleaning your aerators out every Tuesday, we want you to keep doing that. What we don't want you to do is, if we're testing on Thursday, we don't want you to come in and flush and clean your aerators out on Thursday. So we want you to keep doing what you're doing to keep yourself safe, but don't change the circumstances based on the sampling time. So we're trying to make that clear and make the rule a little more protective, if you will. Lead action advisory levels. Current action level is at 15 parts per billion. Again, it's an action level. It is not a health level. The current rule doesn't specifically say what you need to do at single houses with high lead results. So we're going to propose some changes. We're going to reduce the lead action level to 10 parts per billion by 2024. That gives the water supplies one more round of testing to get through with the 15 parts per billion, and then we'll go to the more conservative 10 parts per billion. And it also establishes that household advisory level of 40 parts per billion. So if any particular house that's sampled has a level above 40 parts per billion, that triggers the Health and Human Services and the local health departments to come in and start doing things to protect the residents of that house or apartment or wherever it happens to be, including some blood lead level testing and some evaluation of the plumbing system in that home to see what they can do to reduce the lead levels. Transparency in public education. The current rule has several requirements for public education and public notice in it, but they're only after the fact. They're usually only after an exceedance. And obviously there's a consumer confidence report that comes out that has some discussion about lead levels in the system. What we're going to try and do with these proposed changes is to establish a statewide council that can develop public awareness materials and put those out to the states. We're also going to require every community supply that has 50,000 or more to establish a council to produce materials that are specific to their circumstance. We're going to increase or decrease the amount of time for the notifications. There's already a requirement for 3 business days, but it's not in this portion of the lead and copper rule. We're going to put that in there to make it very clear what the timelines are, and we're going to shorten consumer notice if you have a hit that's over 40 parts per billion. We're going to decrease that timeline. We had At one time, all communities over 1,000 folks had to have we had a proposal that they had to have a board, but we were concerned about the level of expertise in those small communities and the burden that it places on those small communities to set up another council to do this. So that's why the statewide council is there to kind of cover that. We're also concerned with consistency. If you've got all these different councils out there producing different materials, you start to get mixed messages across the state. So the 50,000 we thought was a good point to produce consistent message across the state. Corrosion control treatment and water quality parameters. Obviously, corrosion control treatment, it's there to minimize the corrosivity, the aggressiveness of the water, if you will, to leach lead out and copper out of the system. Water quality parameters are those things that give the water system an idea of how aggressive their water is. They're more proactive tests that they've got to do. The current rule, it allows smaller systems to monitor only when they're having action level exceedances, and we thought that was not a very good idea. They should be monitoring all the time. If they've got corrosion control treatment in place, they ought to be monitoring that corrosion control treatment, those water quality parameters all the time, not just when there's a action level exceedance. So we're going to tighten that up. We're going to add chloride and sulfate to water quality parameters that the systems are going to have to test for, because there's a ratio between those two that gives you another indicator of how corrosive, how aggressive your water is. We're going to require all supplies with corrosion control treatment to monitor annually instead of every 3 years. And we're going to clarify requirements that corrosion control treatment has to be kept in place during a water source change or a treatment change. So those are the 7 major areas for the new rules. Where we're going next is to finalize these draft rules, and again, these are final draft rules. Right now, these are proposed draft rules, so still very preliminary. We've got to have we're hoping to have the final rules in early January. We're hoping to have a public comment period that'll open up on the 15th of January, and then we will have a public hearing on the 30th of January or thereabouts in this location. So, thank you. Thank you for your interest in the lead and copper rule. Thank you for coming out. We're going to have an open question and answer period here. But before I get into that, I wanted to thank our stakeholders. These folks gave up a lot of their time. We've had 5, I think, stakeholder sessions that required a lot of work, required a lot of homework, required a lot of exercises to come up with these rules. So the stakeholders represented you very well, and I want to thank them for what they've done.